Tell me, where do you usually watch my videos? At home, work, or somewhere else?
You don't really realize where you stand in your own family until you're on the floor, barely breathing, with your heart beating like a broken drum, and your vision going gray around the edges, and you make that one call, the one that's supposed to be your lifeline. And instead of help, you get dismissed like a stranger trying to sell something at the door. That night, when I collapsed in my bathroom, my face hitting the cold tile so hard I split my lip, the only number I could press was my mom's, because my ex-husband had stopped pretending to care a year earlier, and I didn't want to scare my friends. It wasn't the first time I felt my body shutting down from exhaustion and pain, but it was the first time I knew I wouldn't make it through without help. I remember holding the phone with shaking fingers, the cold floor seeping into my skin like ice, and the dial tone sounded so far away, like I was underwater. When my mom finally picked up, she didn't say hello the way moms do when they hear panic in your voice. She just sighed and said, "Emily, it's 9 o'clock. What's wrong now?" I told her I couldn't move, that something was wrong with my heart, that I'd been in pain for weeks, and now I couldn't even stand up without nearly blacking out. I waited for her voice to change, for the panic to creep in, for the maternal instinct to kick in like I'd seen in movies, but instead she said, and I remember every word, "You really need to drink more water. You push yourself too hard. Maybe you need to meditate." I hung up before she could finish the next line. I already knew it would be something about my type A personality and how it was finally catching up to me. That night, I called an ambulance myself, which meant another medical bill added to the pile that was already eating me alive. I was 38, single, and buried under nearly $60,000 of medical debt after 2 years of autoimmune complications that nobody seemed to take seriously. I had fought through every appointment, begged for answers, changed diets, tried medications, missed work, and drained my savings trying to stay alive and stay employed. And my family, the ones who'd taken credit for my independence my whole life, hadn't even offered to help me cover an Uber to urgent care. 3 months later, my cousin Kayla sent me a picture that made my hands go numb from anger. It was a group photo, one of those fake happy, golden light Instagram shots of my parents, beaming, their arms around my brother Ryan as he stood in front of a log cabin with a stupid little "Welcome Home" sign hanging from the porch. The caption read, "Ryan finally gets his retreat. He deserves a break after such a tough few years." Let me give you some context, in case this already sounds like a misunderstanding. Ryan is 35, hasn't worked a full-time job since 29, dropped out of grad school twice, and has spent the last 5 years working on his music, which is code in my family for spending all day smoking weed, complaining about capitalism, and asking our parents for money. But Ryan was always the golden one. Sensitive. Misunderstood. Special. I was the practical one, the responsible one, the fixer. The one who babysat him every summer while my parents worked late, even though I was only 2 years older. The one who didn't cry too much or ask for things because we had to make sacrifices. It took me weeks to get the full story, but eventually I found out from Kayla that my parents had used part of their retirement savings to buy Ryan a modest cabin near Mount Hood, saying he needed peace to heal. My mother apparently told her that Ryan's soul was so fragile and that Emily would understand because she's always been the strong one. No one had mentioned a word of it to me. Not even a text. At the time they were wiring over 100 grand to give my emotionally stunted brother a mountain escape, I was on the phone with collection agencies begging for a payment plan that wouldn't get my wages garnished. The thing that broke me wasn't the money. It wasn't even the favoritism, because let's be honest, it had always been there, of a low hum under every birthday party and holiday meal. The thing that broke me was the realization that even at my sickest, even at my absolute bottom, my parents didn't see me as someone worth saving. I wasn't their daughter in distress. I was just the competent one who'd figure it out, like I always did. And if I didn't? Well, they wouldn't notice until Christmas dinner was awkward. That night I sat in the dark on my apartment floor, the photo of Ryan's cabin open on my laptop, the bills spread out around me like a sea of failures, and something in me shifted. It wasn't rage, not the hot, screaming kind I'd felt before. It was colder. Cleaner. A silent kind of fury that doesn't need to shout because it knows exactly what needs to be done. I realized I didn't want revenge in the way you see in movies. I didn't want to call them screaming or post something dramatic online or send back a long email telling them how they failed me. I wanted something better. I wanted them to feel nothing. No access. No explanations. Just the slow, creeping weight of absence. I started planning that night. Not a dramatic exit. Just a quiet unraveling. A fading they couldn't trace. Because if there was one thing I knew for sure after that call, it was this: they didn't see me until they needed something from me. So what would happen if I simply stopped being available? Would they even notice I was gone? Or would they just keep buying cabins and telling themselves they'd raised two great kids? That was the night I stopped trying to be the daughter they didn't deserve. And that was just the beginning. There's something uniquely maddening about being asked, after decades of silence and self-sacrifice, why you never said anything, why you didn't speak up sooner, why you didn't let people know how you felt. As if you hadn't been screaming your truth in every exhausted sigh, every quiet withdrawal, every time you swallowed the urge to cry or scream or just walk away, and instead kept showing up, kept helping, kept carrying the load that nobody acknowledged even existed. When my mother sent the first message after I started to slowly pull away, it was short, brittle in tone, the kind of text you read twice because you're not sure if it's condescending or clueless. You've been quiet lately. Everything okay? And I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't know what to say, but because every possible response I considered felt like a waste of oxygen. By then, it had been nearly 6 weeks since I'd responded to any group messages, 3 months since I'd picked up a phone call from either of them, and just a few days since I'd quietly removed myself from the family calendar app they insisted we all use, even though they only checked it to make sure Ryan's birthday was properly marked with a heart and exclamation marks. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't leave a final message. I just started reclaiming the air around me. It was terrifying at first, this sense that I was violating some unspoken rule that said daughters don't just disappear, but it was also something else, something unfamiliar, something almost thrilling. For the first time in my adult life, I was choosing myself, not loudly, not defiantly, but clearly. But the messages didn't stop. If anything, they escalated in frequency and emotional tone, as though my absence had triggered some parental alarm system that had never activated during my actual emergencies. First, there were the casual ones: saw a movie you'd love, or your dad fixed the dryer finally, haha. Those weird, breezy texts designed to pretend everything was normal, and then, when I didn't respond, the undertones changed. My mother began adding passive-aggressive little touches, writing things like, "We're worried about you, but maybe you're just too busy for family these days," or "I hope you haven't forgotten that Ryan's birthday is coming up. He always loved hearing from you." Each one of those texts felt like a slap, not because of what was said, but because of what was missing. No apology, no acknowledgement, no mention of the long nights I'd spent in a hospital bed alone, or the suffocating weight of bills that had swallowed my life, or even the basic fact that they had chosen to financially and emotionally support a man who had never once shown the capacity to care for anyone but himself. You have to understand, this didn't start with the cabin. That was just the final, undeniable insult. I'd been watching the imbalance since we were kids. Ryan could forget chores, skip school, talk back, throw tantrums in public, and he was always met with soft eyes and explanations about how boys just struggle sometimes, and he's very sensitive. Meanwhile, I was the one told to keep it together, to set an example, to help him regulate his emotions, which, looking back, was just a fancy way of saying I had to parent my own brother while still being a child myself. When he stole from a neighbor's garage at 13, my parents grounded me too, because you knew what he was doing and didn't stop it. When he dropped out of college for the second time, they paid off his debt and told him he was brave for trying. When I graduated with honors while working 2 part-time jobs, they said, "Well, you've always been responsible. That's just who you are." So no, I didn't say anything, not because I didn't notice, not because I wasn't hurt, but because every time I did try to express even a flicker of discomfort, I was met with some form of gaslighting. I was too sensitive, or reading into things, or holding on to old stuff that doesn't matter anymore. My silence wasn't passivity, it was survival. It was the only way I knew to keep peace in a family that had written me into a role I never auditioned for, a role I was never allowed to outgrow. But now the script was breaking down. My refusal to play my part was causing confusion, and that confusion made them angry. When I ignored their fourth or fifth message, they stopped pretending to be concerned and started implying blame. "We don't know what we did wrong," my dad texted one night, "but it would be nice if you could be an adult and tell us instead of acting like a teenager." That one stayed on my screen for a long time. I stared at it, reread it, felt that old pulse of guilt crawl up my spine, the reflex that made me want to fix things, to smooth over the conflict, to explain myself. But something in me, something raw and protective, finally spoke louder than the guilt. I didn't respond. I turned off my phone and went to bed. In the quiet, I started thinking not about what they had done recently, but about all the ways I had tried, year after year, to earn their affection. I thought about the time I flew across the country for my dad's retirement party, even though I'd just been through a flare-up and could barely walk. I thought about the birthday card I sent my mom last year, with a handwritten letter folded inside, telling her how much I wished we could be closer, something she never mentioned or acknowledged. I thought about how many times I'd listened to Ryan cry over breakups and dead-end projects, comforting him, encouraging him, being the sister he needed, even when he didn't deserve it. And none of that, not a single effort, had ever earned me the kind of love they gave him without question. That night, I began to understand something dangerous but true. They weren't going to change. They didn't want to. They wanted access, not accountability. They wanted me close enough to play the part, but not so close that I'd remind them of their own failures. And once I stopped playing along, once I pulled away, they weren't interested in understanding why. They just wanted the disruption fixed. So I made a decision, not out of rage, not even out of grief, but out of something sharper. I would give them exactly what they asked for all those years. Silence. Graceful, final, irreversible silence. No explanations. No blow-ups. Just absence. A clean, steady erasure. Because if they were going to pretend not to understand what they'd done, then they could live in that fiction without me. And maybe, just maybe, one day they'd finally feel what it's like to be the one left behind. The beauty of a quiet exit is that it doesn't require a speech, or a door slammed in anger, or a grand, theatrical gesture that demands attention and explanation. It unfolds like fog at sunrise, slow and subtle, nearly invisible to those who are too self-absorbed to notice the light changing around them. By the time I began putting distance between myself and my family, I wasn't fueled by drama or desperation. I was operating on something much colder, much steadier. Something that came not from pain, but from the numbness that settles in when pain becomes a permanent background noise, like a hum you no longer hear until someone points it out and you suddenly realize you've been gritting your teeth for years. It started with the smallest steps, each one so quiet and reasonable that they could never be accused of being vindictive. I stopped replying to texts that didn't actually ask me how I was. I let voicemails pile up without listening. I missed a family video call, because of work, then another, because I had a migraine, until eventually I wasn't invited at all. I withdrew from the family group chat with a single click, didn't announce it, didn't offer a reason, just removed myself the same way I'd always quietly cleaned up after holiday dinners, silently, efficiently, without praise or acknowledgement. And they barely noticed. Or if they did, they didn't say anything. Because that's how it had always worked in our family. If Emily was quiet, it was probably because she was busy being strong, and strong people don't need to be checked on, they don't need support. They just carry the load until their backs break, and then someone blames them for not asking for help sooner. But this time, I wasn't waiting for my back to break. I was choosing a new path, one where I wasn't defined by my ability to endure neglect. I began closing the accounts I only kept for the sake of family visibility, Facebook, where my mother posted photos of her brilliant kids and conveniently forgot to mention anything about my illness, Instagram, where Ryan showed off his latest cabin improvements, smiling in that lazy, self-satisfied way that only people with unearned comfort can, and even LinkedIn. Because I realized I was performing for an audience that had already decided I didn't matter unless I was proving something. Then came the harder part, the part that felt more like revenge, even though it was really just reclamation. I sold the antique dresser they'd given me 5 years ago as a family heirloom, which came with the kind of emotional strings that weren't visible until you tried to cut them. That dresser had once belonged to my great-grandmother, and I'd been told, in no uncertain terms, that it was mine to keep as long as I respected the legacy it carried, which was code for "don't you dare do anything with it that we wouldn't approve of." So I sold it to a woman named Lila on Craigslist for a fair price, and used the money to pay off the last of my emergency room debt from the night I collapsed alone. It was the most satisfying exchange I've ever made: wood for freedom, history for dignity, nostalgia for actual peace of mind. And the most ridiculous part? Even after all that, even after months of silence and space, they still didn't reach out with anything resembling clarity. No one said, "We're sorry." No one said, "We should have been there for you." Instead, they doubled down on confusion, sending texts that barely masked their irritation. My father asking, "Are you seriously going to ignore your own family over a misunderstanding?" And my mother writing, "You've always been dramatic when you're under stress. Maybe we should have reminded you that you're loved, but you never gave us the chance." The arrogance of that last line almost made me laugh. As if they had ever been waiting for a chance to love me. As if my entire existence hadn't been one long audition for a role I was never cast in. Around that time, Ryan sent me an email. It was short, written in that half-assed, emotionally lazy style he used for everything, like even his concern came with a deadline. He said he'd heard I was in a weird place, and that maybe it would help to do something creative together. He offered, without irony, to fly me out to the cabin and help him build a recording space in the basement. We could use it to heal, he wrote, and maybe just talk things out, like siblings should. I didn't respond. I didn't even finish reading it. Because it was so absurdly on brand for Ryan to center himself in the fallout of my own crisis, to invite me into the sanctuary that had been purchased with the money my parents refused to spend on saving my health. It wasn't just tone deaf. It was insulting. It was proof that he hadn't changed, and that he never would, because why would he? No one had ever asked him to. At work, I started doing better. With fewer emotional distractions, I had more energy, more focus, more space in my brain that wasn't eaten up by resentment and grief. I got offered a leadership role on a new project and actually accepted it without hesitation, something I hadn't done in years. I started seeing a new therapist, someone who didn't waste time coddling my sense of duty to people who'd never met my needs. And for the first time in a long time, I started to believe that I could live without the need to be understood by the people who raised me. Still, part of me was waiting. Waiting to see if any of them would surprise me. Waiting to be proven wrong about their capacity for reflection, for change, for even a small act of accountability. But all I got was more of the same. That's when the letter arrived. It was handwritten on stationery that I recognized from my mother's office drawer, the kind she used for thank you notes and condolence cards. The envelope was cream-colored, the ink a careful blue, her script tight and precise, like she was trying to prove she was still in control of something. Inside, the letter unfolded in careful lines of forced empathy and unacknowledged cruelty. She wrote about how much they missed me, how confused they were by my behavior, how deeply they wanted to fix whatever this is. And then came the line that stuck with me for days, the one that made my stomach knot and my jaw clench. "We didn't know you were struggling. You should have told us. We always thought you were the strong one." That one sentence undid me, not because it was new, but because it was the same refrain I'd been hearing my entire life, repackaged like a compliment, but carrying the weight of 1,000 abandoned moments. I was tired of being the strong one. I was tired of being expected to hold up the walls while everyone else got to fall apart and be forgiven. And in that moment, I knew I was right to walk away, even if the cost of freedom was being misunderstood forever. Because here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. Sometimes, the only way to reclaim your life is to let the people who hurt you believe they didn't. Let them keep their innocence. Let them cling to the fiction. Let them write their letters and send their texts and wonder endlessly what they did wrong. Because if they couldn't see it when it mattered, they don't deserve the clarity now. And I had no interest in offering them closure. Grief, when it doesn't arrive all at once like a storm but instead seeps in quietly, through the cracks you didn't know were there, carries with it a strange weight. A weight that's not loud or violent, but one that rearranges the furniture of your soul so slowly that one day you look around and nothing is where you left it. By the time I received the letter, the one written in my mother's rigid cursive on heavy cream stationery, the emotional furniture in my life had already been moved so far from its original layout that reading her words felt less like opening a door to reconciliation and more like reading a carefully worded denial from a stranger who had once borrowed my face in photographs and claimed to have known me. She wrote 3 pages, each one dense with the kind of language that sounds concerned if you don't read too closely, but which falls apart under the weight of everything it avoids. There was a kind of studied performance in the way she framed every sentence, the precision with which she described their confusion, their heartbreak, their innocent bewilderment at the sudden absence of their bright, loving daughter. As if I had simply drifted away like a balloon lost to the wind, rather than being pushed to the edge and then ignored as I clung to it. She said things like, "We always thought you were so independent, and it hurts that you felt like you couldn't come to us," as if they hadn't spent years training me to believe that my pain was inconvenient, that my needs were burdensome, that my accomplishments were expected but my suffering was excessive. The letter never mentioned the night I called them from the floor, voice shaking and small, asking for help and being told to hydrate. It didn't acknowledge the cabin, or the money, or the way they had poured resources into Ryan's healing journey, while I rationed medication and canceled doctor appointments because I couldn't afford both groceries and copays in the same week. Instead, she wrote that maybe Ryan just needed more from us and that you've always been stronger, as if strength were some endless reservoir I had chosen to dip into while others, like Ryan, were just born parched and deserving of more water. Reading that letter didn't hurt the way I thought it might. I'd prepared for pain, for a reopening of wounds I'd worked so hard to cauterize with silence and space. But what I felt instead was something closer to confirmation that they hadn't changed, that their version of events would always be narrated from the safe perch of their own comfort, and that any deviation from the image they'd built of me would be met not with humility, but with passive confusion and self-pity. But even then, as much as I wanted to throw it away, to pretend it never arrived, there was a part of me, small and infuriating, that still wanted to believe in the possibility of something different. I didn't want an apology in the abstract. I didn't want "we miss you," or "we're sad," or "we don't understand." I wanted one single moment of clarity, someone, anyone in that family, looking me in the eye and saying, "We failed you." Not out of guilt. Not because I forced them to, but because they finally saw it for themselves. That moment never came. Instead, what came were more messages, more calls, more thin attempts at contact that hovered just enough on the edge of concern to avoid sounding accusatory, but with just enough of a sting to remind me that they still believed I was the problem. My father left a voicemail on a Sunday afternoon, his voice soft but stiff, like he was rehearsing lines he didn't quite understand. "We've been thinking about you. We're here if you ever want to talk. I don't know what we did to make you feel this way, but I just hope we can go back to how things were." That last line, "go back to how things were," sat in my chest like a stone for days. Because how things were, to him, was a system in which I suffered quietly while everyone else rested easy. How things were meant me carrying the emotional debt of an entire family while being denied even the smallest acknowledgement of how heavy it all was. How things were meant pretending I wasn't drowning so they could keep believing they were good parents. Around the same time, I started getting updates from mutual friends and extended family, people who meant well, but who couldn't seem to help themselves from mentioning that my parents seemed off lately, or that my mother had lost some weight from the stress, or that Ryan had told someone at a dinner party that I was just going through something and that he was giving me space because that's what family does. I stopped answering those calls too, because I didn't want to be the villain in their story, but I also wasn't willing to be the ghost anymore, the quiet, loyal, dependable presence who only existed in relation to their comfort. I wanted something else now, something I hadn't let myself want in years. Peace. Real peace. Not the kind that comes from forced forgiveness or polite conversations, but the kind that comes from detachment, from knowing that I no longer needed their validation to justify my own reality. I wanted a life that wasn't measured by my ability to tolerate other people's failings. I wanted to exist without the constant background noise of their disappointment or confusion or need. And so, when they showed up at my door one afternoon unannounced, with a bouquet of tulips in my mother's hand and a look of quiet desperation on my father's face, I didn't answer. I stood behind the curtain, my heart pounding not from fear but from a kind of sick, exhausted awe at the spectacle of it all. They stood there for maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10, my mother eventually setting the flowers gently on the doormat, like she was laying an offering at a grave. They never knocked. They didn't call. They just stood and waited, and then walked away, their shoulders heavy with confusion and hurt they didn't know how to name. And I didn't cry. Not then. Not after. I just sat down on the floor, back against the wall, and stared at the flowers until the light changed and the shadows got long and I could finally feel the air in the room settle around me again. Because this time, I hadn't let them in. Not physically. Not emotionally. Not even a crack in the door. And in that moment, I understood that this silence, this boundary, this refusal, was the real answer they claimed they were looking for. It wasn't a message they could read, or a voicemail they could replay. It was a living, breathing statement. It was me choosing my own peace over their performance of care. They asked what they did wrong. And now, for the first time, I was letting them live with the silence where my explanation used to be. It's a strange thing, the way time reshapes pain, not by erasing it or making it softer, but by changing its texture, dulling its sharpness just enough that you stop flinching every time a memory surfaces, until eventually, the memories stop controlling your breath and simply become part of the air you live in. By the time I moved out of the city, away from the places where I'd collapsed, healed, bled, and grown, I wasn't running anymore, and I wasn't hiding either. I was simply choosing a life where my name didn't echo off the walls of a house built on obligation, guilt, and performance. I didn't send out any grand announcement, didn't post an inspirational quote about boundaries or forgiveness or rebirth. I just packed my things, handed my landlord the keys, and drove toward a town that didn't know my history. That wouldn't ask why I hadn't seen my family in over a year, that wouldn't see my silence as rudeness, but instead as what it really was. Survival in its purest, quietest form. I rented a small place outside Salem, nothing glamorous, just enough space for my dog, my books, and a kitchen where I could finally cook for myself without hearing my mother's voice in my head commenting on the calories, or the mess, or the smell. I started every morning not with anxiety but with stillness, and I worked a job that no longer drained me dry because I'd finally stopped spending half my emotional energy bracing myself for the next wave of family expectations I could never meet. They still texted. That part didn't change. Every Sunday, like clockwork, a message would land on my phone with some version of the same question. Are you okay? Or we're thinking about you, or please talk to us. We don't know what we did wrong. Sometimes it was just a string of photos from Ryan's latest hike, with my mother's caption, "Wish you were here." As though guilt could be wrapped in exclamation points and digital sunshine. At first, I deleted them without opening. Then I stopped even looking. Eventually, they became white noise, a reminder not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd escaped. There was one message, though, that landed differently, not because it said anything new, but because of when it arrived. It was a rainy Thursday evening, one of those still, reflective kinds of nights where the sky feels heavy and everything inside you mirrors the weather. I was sitting on the floor of my living room, sipping tea that had long gone cold, when my phone lit up. The message was from my father, just 3 lines. "We're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to understand. If we said something wrong, we're sorry. We just don't know what we did." It wasn't the first time he'd said it. It wouldn't be the last. But that night, something inside me cracked, not in a way that let them back in, but in a way that made me see the entire situation for what it truly was, without the filter of hurt or anger or history. They didn't know. Not because they were incapable of knowing, but because they had spent a lifetime choosing not to see what was right in front of them. They had shaped a version of me that fit neatly into the margins of their worldview, a daughter who was competent, steady, strong, endlessly reliable, and when I stepped out of that role, not with rage but with distance, they were left holding the script with no one to perform it. And I understood then that my silence was not a puzzle for them to solve, not a punishment, not even revenge. It was the answer. It was the clearest, most honest response I could give to people who had, time and time again, shown me that they were only interested in my presence when it served their comfort. I could have written back. I could have crafted the perfect message, listing every instance of betrayal, every moment of neglect, every time they looked past me and handed love to someone who did nothing to earn it. But what would it change? They weren't asking to change. They were asking to feel better. They were asking to be let off the hook. And I wasn't in the business of emotional absolution anymore. There are moments when I still imagine what it would feel like to sit across from them, to look them in the eyes and tell them everything, not with venom, but with clarity. I think about whether it would give me closure or whether it would just reopen something I've worked so hard to keep closed. And then I remember that they had years to listen, years to pay attention, years to choose differently. My silence isn't cruelty. It's consequence. And unlike them, I don't need to be understood to move forward. Now, my days are quieter. My world is smaller, but more intentional. I've built friendships that feel like family and learned that love doesn't have to be earned through exhaustion. I've learned to celebrate small things, a morning without pain, a kind email from a colleague, a weekend spent in solitude that feels nourishing rather than lonely. I've learned to let go of the need to rewrite the past or make others rewrite theirs. Still, sometimes I wonder late at night, when the quiet is too deep and my thoughts stretch longer than they should, whether they still think about me with confusion, whether they sit in their house with its polished floors and unanswered questions, asking each other what they could have done to make me disappear so completely. I wonder if they scroll through old photos and pause on the ones where I'm smiling just enough to be convincing, but not enough to be real. I wonder if they've finally begun to ask the right questions, or if they're still hoping I'll come back and answer the wrong ones. But most of all, I wonder whether they've realized that sometimes people don't leave because they want to be chased, or because they want attention, or because they're angry. Sometimes they leave because staying means dying in pieces. And sometimes silence is not the absence of love, it's the loudest truth we have when every other form of expression has been ignored or twisted into something it never was. I don't know what they say about me now. Maybe they call it a phase. Maybe they say I burned out. Maybe they tell themselves I'm off the grid, finding myself, healing, grieving. They'd be half right, I guess. Because what I grieve now is not the loss of a family, I never truly had one, but the years I spent trying to earn the bare minimum from people who believed I already had too much. And so, no, I don't answer. I don't return the messages. I don't send letters. I don't explain. Because some stories don't need a final chapter, and some endings are not meant to offer peace, but rather the honest, unresolved truth of what it means to walk away, not because you gave up, but because you finally knew your worth. Let them keep asking. I have no explanation left to give.